Wanna take you for a ride. I wanna take you for a ride. I wanna take you for a ride.
Let's go!
The Resident Evil 3 Remake has received quite the fair amount of criticism since its release. From reviews I've seen, comparison to the 1998 original seems to be a popular route to take among reviewers and critics alike, in terms of content cut, creative choices, and overall the quality and amount of content available. I understand this comparison. It is a remake after all, and people are inevitably going to look at it in the shadow of the original, especially fans that have played through the 1998 version. I wanted to make a review because most of the reviews I have seen have been, for the most part, negative. Usually it begins with the reviewer saying, Resident Evil 3 is great, but... and following that introduction is essentially a numbered list of their supposed negatives with the game. However, I had a fantastic time with this game, and I would go as far as to say it's one of my favorite Resident Evils. And before I'm written off as another action fan drooling at the mouth for another action-oriented Resident Evil game, let me explain myself. I'll be organizing this review into separate categories, so without further ado, let's begin with story. The story for Resident Evil 3 is honestly extremely fun, paced excellently, and has an appropriate amount of difficulty, well at least in my opinion. Although the campaign is extremely fun with satisfying gameplay, it is rather short, with the average completion time being around 4 to 4.5 hours. This can be seen as a negative, and I definitely wish the campaign could have been longer, but just because it's short doesn't affect the overall quality. This campaign starts out with an absolute bang. It opens with Jill in her apartment, and she receives a call from her fellow STARS member, Brad Vickers. While on this call, Nemesis decides to gracefully blow through Jill's apartment wall, making it clear Nemesis is going to be an inescapable threat throughout the game. His new initial design had me intrigued also, with his mutilated face being covered up rather than exposed. Anyhow, with the opening of the game, it is evident that the tone will be quite different from the Resident Evil 2 remake, returning to the action-based elements of the entries in the series like Resident Evil 4. Being a huge fan of 4, 5, and 6, this made me even more excited, because this could potentially mean a fusion of action elements and survival horror elements, and I am glad to say that the game does succeed in this department. The boss fights are certainly more action-oriented, with spectacular set pieces and very articulate designs for the forms of Nemesis you face throughout the game. The story itself is intriguing, combined with the great cinematic visuals. The writing is very realistic, even more so than Resident Evil 2 in my opinion, with characters having more personality and just acting and talking like real people in a zombie apocalypse. The areas you visit in the game all lead closer to the horrible machinations Umbrella has realized, with the final act of the game taking place in an Umbrella laboratory. And I won't say too much about the final boss, but in a simple term, it has Metal Gear Rising level stuff. Yeah. Nikolai returns in his villainous glory, and while not as prominent of a threat, he definitely harbors that trait certain villains have where they just always seem to be one step ahead of you. I enjoyed his presence for the most part, despite how comically evil his character is. I mean, the dude is straight up ruthless in the criminal acts he performs against Jill as well as the other UBCS members. I will agree with the criticism that Nemesis isn't as prominent as he is in the original game, and even Mr. X from the Resident Evil 2 remake, but the game makes up for this with the boss fights and transformations Nemesis takes. I wish I could have recorded my reaction for the reveal of Nemesis' second form, because I was so thrown off, nervous, and excited all at the same time. Some people didn't like this change, but I found it super fun, and as I said before, railgun sequence. Overall, the story wasn't exactly breathtaking in its narrative elements, but it was an intriguing story that made me want to play more. And what more can you really ask for? In comparison to the Resident Evil 2 remake, there is a noticeably less amount of content in Resident Evil 3. The game has one campaign in comparison to the 2 campaigns Resident Evil 2 had, and no, the same exact campaign with the characters switched doesn't count as its own campaign. It doesn't have any extra game modes like Mercenaries, which I consider a lost opportunity, but there's always time to correct that. So, really, the game has the campaign mode and the Resident Evil Resistance add-on, which I can definitely agree with other reviewers, it doesn't make the game's price any more justifiable. Speaking on that, a criticism is that the game should have been DLC due to the lack of content, or that it should have just cost less than $80. And I do agree with this to an extent. I do believe that the game should have costed less due to the amount of content, but I don't believe it should have just been a DLC for Resident Evil 2. There is a clear distinction between Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, in terms of game mechanics to gameplay elements and all-around style. Resident Evil 2 threw action all out the window and opted for the classic survival horror route which people loved. And Resident Evil 3 did the same, but to much less of an extent, as the game has a lot of action-oriented elements with the gameplay, enemies, etc. I think the amount of content in Resident Evil 3 isn't worth $80, but for what you can play, I say it could definitely be a lot worse. So, the replayability with Resident Evil 3 can essentially only stem from the campaign, and although this would make it seem like replayability is an issue, it's not as bad as it would seem. Yes, the lack of game modes and extra content leaves the player of Resident Evil 3 wanting more to do, but I think the campaign has a fair amount of replayability when looking at it the same way as Resident Evil 4's campaign. Resident Evil 4 evidently has more replayability than Resident Evil 3 as I'm recording this due to its other game modes and playable sections, but when looking at how the campaign is replayable in Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 3's campaign is essentially the same way. Resident Evil 3 has 5 different difficulties to choose from when playing the campaign, and upon completing the campaign for the first time, an in-game shop becomes available with items and weapons to buy. I was honestly relieved when I found that you can't buy these items with actual currency. The only way to achieve these upgrades is through completing challenges throughout the game. These consist of objectives in relation to story mode missions, to the amount of kills required with a certain class of weapon. And some of these items and weapons are extremely overpowered, not just obvious additions like the infinite rocket launcher, but the coins as well. Upon holding all the coins, you essentially become a walking tank, and it's much more difficult to die on the lower difficulties. Upon buying these items, it allows you to play through the game again with brand new gear in order to either help you beat the game a lot faster in order to get a better rank, or just play the game with more power. I found this to be a great source of replayability, but it seems I'm one of the very few who think so. Resident Evil 3's enemies are all unique and diverse, with their introductions upon entering new sections, the way you're forced to play because of them, and the style of the creatures. With the zombies, there really isn't much to say. They're essentially the same zombies as Resident Evil 2, but thanks to the dodging mechanic, it's easier to move around them, say when you're being chased by the nemesis. Also, for the most part, they take less bullets, besides those enemies at the laboratory section of the game, because man, those guys can sure eat bullets. The first new enemy you encounter in Resident Evil 3 is the spider, and the section you play with them really manipulates how you have to play against them, due to their speed and how dark the area you're fighting them is. They're very weak but fast, so they're a relatively balanced out enemy. The Gamma creatures also force you to play in a different style, with their only weak point being the inside of their mouth, and you have to shoot that because if it's coming close to you and its mouth is open, if you don't hit it, it's an instant kill. The Hunters are back with an updated look to more represent their monstrous, ungodly nature compared to their original design, and their strength is certainly back as well, with a one-hit attack that must be dodged, as well as being bullet sponges. The Lickers Maker return when playing as Carlos in the police department, and while they don't seem to have any new additions from Resident Evil 2, they're just as strong and annoying. The Nemesis-infected zombies with the unbearably long-range swipes were also very annoying throughout my playthrough at least, due to their weak spot only opening at certain times, and their range being absolutely broken. Overall, the enemies felt fresh and creative. It didn't feel derivative from Resident Evil 2 at all, which I initially thought was going to happen in some cases. The Lickers throughout the police department may feel a little derivative, but for the most part, I just felt like it was a nice callback more than anything. Each character in Resident Evil 3 has received a huge upgrade, not just in terms of aesthetics, but also in their personalities and development. Jill's new design fuses her original look with a modern and realistic take, and it's honestly great. She definitely received the Resident Evil 2 remake treatment in that category. Carlos's new design is just, come on. That's fantastic. I love Carlos's new design so much more than his original look, it's kind of insane. The characters' upgrades and personalities as well. As I mentioned previously, the characters in Resident Evil 3 are much more realistic compared to its original. Jill is a cool and collected badass, but when pushed becomes this unstoppable, ruthless force. Carlos is simply trying to do the right thing however he can, even if that means risking his life in the midst of monsters and horrible creatures, because he realizes that it's his job. The side characters like Tyrell and Nikolai even have their identifiable personalities as well. One of my favorite aspects of Resident Evil games is the characters, so whenever they get an upgrade or a new good creative change, it really makes my gaming experience that much better. Resident Evil 3, albeit having a short story mode and not an incredible amount of content, it is a super fun ride that I enjoyed every second of. It really made me appreciate Resident Evil's audacity in being creative and always trying to reinvent old mechanics, characters, and enemies. The game has received mostly negative feedback, which makes me feel bad, because I truly believe this game is awesome. Not exactly a masterpiece, but awesome. Sure, it favors action over horror in some areas, but when it boils down to it, the game is a fun, fresh experience that I was extremely happy with, and I can't wait for the next entry in the series.